the moral of the story is I need to check out Cordova because I think you guys are living in a little slice of heaven out there. My name's Josh Smith. I'm your resident plant geek living in the Anchorage area. Originally grew up in Fairbanks, and I've kind of been playing around with some and experimenting with growing our native berries, and there's been a lot of success and a lot of failures. And I'd like to share some of that and hopefully expand upon that. And I'd love to hear from your experiences too, because by no means am I any sort of authority on the subject. I've just learned some things and I want to share some things. And hopefully you walk away from this presentation just inspired to grow native berries. Honestly, it's once you learn a couple tricks of the trade, they're pretty easy. So, oh, and I guess I'm supposed to mention that I have a little native plant nursery here, but that's not the important part. Um, so, first and foremost, a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm really neurospicy, and this is my hyperfixation, so I'm probably going to talk way too fast about the subject. If you need clarification, or if you want to, or you want me to repeat what I just said, or if you have something to add, please let me know. I will absolutely pause where we're at, and if there's some niche little idea or rabbit hole you want to go down, just know I'm committed. I will go down that rabbit hole with you, because it's not really. I have the PowerPoint because I hear that's what adults do, but that's not really the intent of just getting through the PowerPoint and checking the boxes. I really just, if there's a niche interest, that's really where I want to expand on. Because again, the goal is for us all to be inspired to do more of this. Because I don't think any of the problems that exist in this world revolve around too many native plants. So, next slide, please. So this is roughly what I'm going to be covering in today's presentation, and I guess I'll get into it. I understand Cordova is within the EAC homeland. Here in Anchorage, I am a visitor on Denina land, so with that, I want to pay forward my respect to the elders of past and present, and the stewardship they've afforded in conjunction with this landscape since time immemorial. I know this to be true that through indigenous sovereignty, leadership, and education, and maybe some native berry propagation, the abundance of this land can be preserved for generations to come. So let's do that and be part of that. And let's all grow some more beautiful native plants because I think they belong in all of our yards. A little bit about me. I was a plant geek that grew up in North Pole. So you can imagine there's some very big conflicting entities that go against one another. North Pole, Zone 1, maybe a 90-day growing season, -60 in the winter, 90 in the summer. So being a plant guy in Fairbanks, North Pole, it taught me that I had to think outside the box. And it also taught me the value of our native plants. So I would try to grow domestic cultivars of blueberries, probably things that some of the berries that you guys have tried to grow in Cordova, and still they just never thrived because they never really adapted to our region. They were developed in regions east of the Rockies where they have warm summers, they may have colder winters, but just they didn't adapt to the specific parameters of our climate. But then I would look at the bog blueberries that grew in every black spruce bog in the Fairbanks area, and they would just thrive. Nobody was giving them nitrogen. Nobody was coddling them. And every year there would be abundance of berries. And you probably can speak to that, a similar experience in Cordova. You try to plant a high bush blueberry, like a domestic cultivar, and it may survive. It may flower. It may produce berries, but you kind of have to coddle it when you have high bush blueberries that just thrive on their own under the hemlocks and spruce. So it kind of taught me that, like, hey, maybe there's some value to these native plants. But then I ran into the issue of, hey, well, now I'm convinced these native plants belong in my landscape. How do I go about buying them or growing them? And that's when I realized, oh, yeah, that there is no native plant nursery here in Alaska. Or if they are, they're far off, or it's only niche little, they only grow a couple things. I started realizing that these plants weren't available and not many people had done the work in trying to figure out how to grow them. And so that's kind of where this experiment started. I realized that there's a demand for these. I want to grow these awesome plants, and there isn't any availability. So growing up in Fairbanks, it also taught me that growing plants in Fairbanks, you recognize that there's a significant risk of failure. And it's not necessarily failure. I like to consider it lessons learned, or at least that's how I justified losing all the money and all the plants that died every winter. But I learned fairly early on that basically I was going to have to figure some of these out because in reality, like I knew that like failure was always an option. I knew that like some of this stuff wasn't going to work, but I realized that a lot of these native plants, the work hasn't really been done to grow them. So I really wasn't that afraid of them not germinating because right now I didn't have any bog blueberries. So if it doesn't work, I'll still have no bog blueberries. But then I started experimenting, reading into some publications over in Scandinavia and Canada and lower 48, a lot of work by Patricia Holloway at UAF. And some of the things started germinating. Once I learned about stratification, scarification, and basically some of the climatic parameters of these plants, I started realizing that we can kind of crack the code if we replicate what nature does. So that's kind of a little bit of my lens. And now being in Anchorage, being in the banana belt compared to the interior, a lot more options for a lot more different species. And you guys are even warmer than me, so you guys have lots of options and some beautiful species that grow out there. Just a side note, I have an entire flat of the native beach strawberries, thanks to Scott, because he brought me frozen strawberries from Cordova. So some of my berries that I'm growing in my grow room are specifically from Cordova. So thank you, Cordova. Um, And then, so then moving on, we're going to discuss like, okay, we talk about, okay, berries need winter, they need summer, but there's terms that apply to that. And when we talk about stratification, scarification, these are just sciencey terms that apply to what would happen in nature. And so we'll kind of expand on why this is important and like understanding what stratification, scarification means. And then you can apply that reasonably to our species and usually get them to germinate. And then we'll kind of get into the meat and potatoes of why we're here, which I'm assuming is growing some beautiful native berries. So with that, before we move on, are there any questions? Anything you're really excited about? Anything like that? Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So we talk about definitions, and so a little bit of expectation management so we can understand like, okay, hey, when Josh is talking about cuttings versus layering versus seed propagation, this is my slide that kind of just overall discusses that. So when it talks about like the differences between cuttings and layering and seed and division, basically we're deciding whether we are trying to create more plants and more genetically diverse plants, or if we're trying to clone a plant. So let's say probably the most common currant species you guys have in Cordova. Would that be your guys' gray and stink currants, or do you guys have more trailing black currants? Any idea?
I think it's stink currants.
Stink currants, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay. Absolutely. So stink currants are like, I don't find them any further west than Whittier. They're one of my favorites. So let's say you find for whatever reason you have a favorite stink currant that grows in the forest. I don't know many people that have one of those, but you never know. Let's say you have a favorite stink currant that you just love. It has the biggest berries. They're the sweetest. They have the most beautiful like silvery film on them, that yeasty coating, and you just absolutely love that plant. If you take berries from that plant and go plant them, yes, you're going to have a lot of seedlings, but the seedlings won't necessarily be an exact replica of that parent. Just so you think of like if you have 10 children, if a couple has 10 children, each child will be its own unique individual. They may have characteristics of each parent, but you'll never have an exact clone of the parent. The same is true even with our native berries. Even though they're fairly genetically they're fairly similar, you're not going to have a whole lot of variation. Variation does exist within populations. It may not be something that's visual. The blueberry plant next to a blueberry plant may not look any different, but there are little nuances, little genetic differences from plant to plant. It's never an exact clone from plants. So you have that favorite stink currant that you want to propagate. Planting seeds is not the option. So then you start looking into options of how do I clone this mother plant? That's where your cuttings and your layering come into place. So let's say you just want one from your yard. You have this beautiful stink currant and you want to grow one for your yard. Well, a lot of our native species have this beautiful ability where let's say there's a wind event and a hemlock blows down and it takes a branch of that gray currant, pins it along the ground. Instead of just succumbing and just whimpering and realizing this is the end, a lot of times these species will start rooting, that branch in the moss will start rooting into the moss. And then it's still a clone. It's still connected to the parent plant, but it allows it to start rooting, and then it actually will start growing up. It basically expanding the plant. It becomes a clone. So in horticultural context, this is where you can actually divide it from the mother plant once it's established a root system, and you could then remove that clone and take it to a separate location. So this is one of those where, hey, in nature, this may be where a hemlock falls over, or maybe heavy snow winter pins a branch along the ground, some sort of like rock or some sort of like geologic event basically causes this plant to end up laying on the ground in a layer. You can replicate this by, hey, I can pin this branch along the ground. I can probably ball moss around it with air layering. I could pin it along the ground with a log. I can just basically simulate something that would happen in nature. Well, species like your currants, your stink currant, has enough growth hormones and it wants to grow enough that it will start rooting into that mossy media. And anywhere between 6 and 18 months later, there will be enough of a root mass that you can actually divide it from the parent plant and remove it. So if you just want one plant, that's a great way of going about it. But let's say you want to propagate 10 of them. You want to basically grow these stink currants and you want to donate them to all of your neighbors because for whatever reason, every one of your neighbors absolutely loves the stink currant plant. You all have a favorite stink currant. The thing is then at that point, do you pin all the branches along the ground and layer them and divide them off? No, that's probably going to be pretty damaging to the parent plant and it may or may not recover. So then you start looking at other options of how do I clone this plant in a way that is more efficient with the material that's there, but also not destructive to the overall the plant. So this is where your cuttings come in. So cuttings are basically you are removing a piece of living material, usually a piece of branch with a couple buds, and from there you're going to be putting it in a media, and then with the special right environment, in theory it's going to root. Some species like Saskatoons, you're probably not going to get those to root, but other species like currants, you stick them in dirt, they're probably going to root, especially if you do it the right time of year. So cuttings become an option where you could take a 3 foot long branch, cut it into like 4 to 6 inch long segments, and you could be looking at 6 to 8 potential new plants. So it's a lot less material for what you want to do. So the layering is great if you just want one or two. If you want more than that, that's where your cuttings come into play. Let's see. I don't remember if oh yeah, okay. My next slide, I talk about the differences in cutting. So I don't want to get too ahead of myself. Again, ADHD's it's my curse and my blessing, I guess. So next we talk about seed grown. So, and then also with cuttings and layering, you could also, that's where division would come in. So if you're trying to divide salmon berries, or if you're trying to divide lagoon berries, that's where you'd remove chunks of plant material and roots and move them else. And at that point, it would be a clone of the parent plant, just like if you were taking a cutting or if you were layering. So any questions so far? Okay, so next, this is my favorite, and I'm going to get more into why it's my favorite to begin next. But seed grown. So seed grown, people get intimidated when growing things from seed, and it's a lot of patience. It does require some patience, but you can, like that same stink currant plant that you have there. If you love that plant, but you're not necessarily sold on like it has to be genetically this plant, you collect a couple of the berries. Each berry could have anywhere between 10 and probably 30 seeds in it. So each berry you can produce more than enough plants for the entire neighborhood, and that one berry is like minuscule, will have a minuscule impact on the local environment, the ecology. You're just growing some more stink currants. So I'm trying to hold back and not get ahead of myself. But so that's where seed grown would come in. But with seed grown, again, it's never going to be genetically the same as the parent plant. It's going to be its own unique individual, which I think diversity is a good thing when it comes to growing these plants. Whether it's differences in disease resistance, hardiness, berry production, some will have different berry colors or shapes or sizes, but I'll get into that more later. When we talk about stratification, so whenever you go look up, let's say you want to go plant some seeds, and basically you look it up online, they're like, oh, it requires 60 days of warm stratification, 60 days of cold stratification. What does that actually translate to? So you have to, so a little bit of a story here. If you think about, let's say, okay, you have a blueberry that's basically growing in the forest in the understory of Cordova, and every berry that ripens just falls right there to the ground and then germinates. You have a beautiful abundance of berries. They're all growing together. You know, each seedling is its own unique individual, and so basically, you know that. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a beautiful patch of blueberries that are all growing, and then you have a nasty windstorm where you have a landslide that comes in. You could wipe out an entire genetic population of plants. And also, okay, try not to get ahead of myself again. So basically, we talk about stratification and scarification. Basically, these berries know that basically, hey, if we all grow in the same spot, our genetic lineage is probably not going to perpetuate itself. And also, if this berry germinates in the fall, if it falls on the ground and germinates there in August or September, it's not going to have enough time to grow and set a terminal bud and survive the winter. So these berries have to undergo processes in order to basically know that it's safe to germinate. So some species, like your cloudberry or your salmonberry, they're meant to be eaten by birds or bears. So they have to then survive the passage through the GI tract. But what happens is when a bear or a bird ends up eating these berries, it's going to then eat the berry and then go a mile that way and then go deposit the berry seeds. Now you've spread the genetics well beyond the reach of like a single geologic event or a single like a meteorological event. And now the genetics can perpetuate and continue on. But the seeds then have to survive basically the passage through the animal. And that's where basically we have to simulate that process through a process called scarification. Well, I talked about basically the seed, if it germinates in the fall, it probably won't have enough time to basically complete a growth cycle and go dormant. So that's where stratification comes in. The seed knows that it needs to go through winter in order to be safe to germinate in the spring. So a lot of times these seeds have a growth inhibiting hormone in the germ itself, in the embryo, that basically says, I'm not ready to germinate because I have trust issues and I know I'm growing in Alaska. So this hormone will sit there and keep it completely dormant, just sitting in the soil profile. But there's this magic Goldilocks zone between 33 and 40 degrees that if the seed is moist and sitting between 33 and 40 degrees, that hormone level starts diminishing. And basically from doing that, each species has its own requirement of days in this window, but if the required amount is met, then basically the seed then knows that once it warms up, spring has arrived and it's safe to germinate. So that's been one of the biggest challenges of like what cracking the code of what's the magic recipe to get a lot of our species to germinate. And so I simulate cold stratification or winter with basically my crisper drawer, my fridge. A warm stratification is like, hey, I don't want to germinate yet, so I'm going to go through a summer, a winter, and then germinate the following summer. So warm stratification is on my counter. But in nature, this could be a seed that's just sitting on the moss or in the moss for years, and then something happens, and they're happy finally, and they germinate. So a lot of our species, it's not something that necessarily germinate a week later. A lot of times there's a little bit of pre-treatment that's required to basically make the seeds happy and feel warm and fuzzy, and they're safe to germinate. So we'll talk a little more on that here soon. And then we talked about the scarification. Okay, hey, that's where a seed would be distributed. Basically, it's meant to be passed through an animal and then get distributed elsewhere. So in terms of us, a scarification is like, okay, well, the seed, in order to survive the passage through the bear, it has to have a hard outer seed coat to survive basically the gastric acid. So that hard outer seed coat, known as an endocarp, has to basically protect it from all the acids. But if it doesn't pass through the bear, now that seed is basically encapsulated in a really hard outer shell that may or may not be ready to germinate. It may not even let water to the embryo, may not even start stratification. The seed may just sit there and just chill for years and years if it doesn't travel through the bear. So if we want to basically overcome that dormancy of the scarification, either you make a bear friend, which I don't have too many of those, or you have to overcome that with, some people use sandpaper, some people use a blender, some people use fermentation. For domestic raspberry breeders, they use battery acid. I'm not committed to that life. It's a little bit excessive if you ask me, but it works for them. So basically, we'll talk about like the difference between mechanical and chemical scarification, how you can overcome basically that hard outer seed coat and allow water to enter the embryo and begin that biological process, which is stratification. And then we'll also discuss like, hey, where do I recommend you do outdoor propagation in like nursery beds or garden beds? Where do I recommend you start indoors early? And again, none of these are absolute rules. It's just what's worked for me so far. And hopefully within the next couple of years, you guys get back to me, let me know what works or what doesn't work or what you liked. Because I think of this as a big citizen science project. I think we're all going to learn this together. And again, the more of us that grow native plants, the better. So any questions so far? Okay. So we talk about cuttings and layering. So again, we're back on the topic of that beautiful stink currant that you just absolutely love and your neighbors just want a bunch of for whatever reason. And it's the talk of the town and everybody wants a stink currant. So we talk about the cuttings and layering. We discussed the layering where you can take a branch, pin it along the ground, and it can then root out and then you separate it from the mother plant. This is something that works with domestic currants and domestic gooseberries as well. In theory, it'll work with other species as well. Just the ribes species typically root rather readily. But then cuttings, because we talked about how the layering is great for you, but if all your neighbors want this clone as well, you're probably going to want to use cuttings. Well, cuttings are interesting because basically you are removing that piece of material, that branch, from the roots. So basically that branch has a limited amount of nutrients and water and basically life force left in it, and it will rapidly, you put it out on a sunny day, it will dry to the point it doesn't stand a chance. So with cuttings, it's always the race against time of getting the plant to establish more roots before it desiccates so it can replenish the nutrients and the water that are being lost through evaporation and desiccation. So the way we overcome that is there's two methods, actually technically three, but I'm just going to cover two of them, of basically collecting wood at different times of the year and different parameters that have to be met in order to potentially get these plants to root. So we talk about cuttings. The two different types of cuttings I'm going to discuss are hardwood and softwood cuttings. So hardwood cuttings are awesome in the fact that you go out there right now in Cordova, you have that favorite stink currant, there's no leaves on it, it's hardened off for winter, it's ready for freezing, it's ready for thawing, it's ready for rain and snow and freezing rain and everything Cordova can throw at it. So it's basically all the nutrients, all the water, all the extra stuff is down in the roots, and it's basically just fully dormant, just surviving the winter. Well, the cool thing about that is we talked about how when you take a cutting, you're basically trying to get it to establish roots before it completely desiccates. Well, this hardwood cutting has sealed itself off from the outside world. The buds have hardened, the bark has toughened up. It's not losing water very quickly at all because it's not being supplied a whole lot of water from the roots. The ground may be frozen. So because of this, it actually buys you some time. When you collect hardwood cuttings, when the plant is dormant, you can collect these branches and it buys you time because it's not actively losing water. It's not actively desiccating. It's already sealed off from the outside environment. So all you have to do is get it to root before it does end up desiccating. So that's where hardwood cuttings would come in. So you would collect those this time of year. The downside to hardwood cuttings is not all hardwood cuttings want to root very well. Again, your ribes species, like that picture right there on the PowerPoint, that's ribes glandulosum, or known as the skunk currant. it's one of those where it wants to root. It has tons of growth hormone and rooting hormone already in it with a little bit of additional like dip and grow. It will root readily and it's just ready to go. Others like your Saskatoons or even some of our native blueberries, they may not be as ready to root because again, when they're dormant, they don't have as much growth hormone just flowing through their cells. So they may not be ready to root as readily as maybe some of your ribes species. So this works really well for like high bush cranberries and like all of the ribes like the currants and gooseberries. And again, it translates to your domestic cultivars as well. Softwood cuttings are fun, and this is usually what the professionals end up going for. Again, they don't work very well for me, so I don't classify myself as a professional. But so when softwood cuttings are happening, the plant is actively growing. They're pumped full of growth hormone because basically you would collect these when they have leaves on them. They're actively growing and like the tip is still a little soft and like they're starting to toughen up at the bottom. This would also border on semi-hardwood cuttings, but I'm not going to go into the nuances there. So the plant is ready to root. And a lot of times they root a lot quicker from softwood cuttings than hardwood cuttings. But you have to figure, unlike all the benefits of your hardwood cuttings where they're sealed off from the outside environment and basically they're basically time capsules. They're basically ready to just sit there and they could root slowly before leafing out. So they're not going to desiccate very quickly. Softwood cuttings, you have a couple hours in the sun and they will be desiccated beyond the point of being able to root because basically they lose so much water that they are unable to expend any nutrients to establish a root system. So they'll end up desiccating before anything roots. So softwood cuttings, though, so the key to them is you have to create a super humid environment where they're not desiccating. They're not just hemorrhaging water and nutrients. It's one of those where they can the moisture is being maintained. Therefore, they have time that shorter duration, but still a duration to root and establish before they end up desiccating. So you create a really humid environment. The downside to a super humid environment, as you know, probably in Cordova, is molds and fungus and microbes. It just everything wants to grow when it's moist, especially when it's warm and moist. So that's where you some people dabble with antifungal treatments and things like that. I only use the softwood cuttings for select varieties. I use them for like my kiwis, not native, but um, there's others that just like haskaps, things like that. They don't root fast enough. They like the leaves like to mold. So you have to kind of treat that so the mold isn't a huge issue. But you also, if you have a stem that has 6 leaves on it, you don't want to necessarily leave all of those 6 leaves on there because basically each leaf is just going to desiccate even into humid environments. Either going to mold, it's going to hemorrhage moisture. So it's basically becomes a weak point in that cutting and basically allows the cutting's quality to go down in quality faster before it can root. So the key to that is if you have 6 leaves, you're removing 4 of the bottom leaves because that whole portion of the stick is going to be going into the media, whether it's peat moss or pro mix or perlite or sand. You're sticking it down in there. Then those top 2 leaves, that's still a lot of surface area. You want photosynthesis. You don't want to basically cut off all the photosynthesis. So you want a little bit of leaf material, but you don't want full leaves. So that's where the pros would take the leaf and they would cut off 2/3 of it. And they leave just that little bottom third of the leaf attached to the top and then they stick it in the media and they keep it in a super humid environment. Especially if you dip it in like a growth hormone, like a dip and grow or Hormex, a lot of times it will root within a week, week and a half. And because you basically reduce the surface area, it doesn't desiccate as quickly. And because it's actively growing when you removed it from the mother plant, it's then ready. It's pumped full of rooting hormones. It's ready to root into the media. So there's more flexibility when it comes to hardwood cutting. So if you're new to cuttings, I would definitely recommend go out to your nearest current plant and go collect some cuttings and stick them in media. They root rather readily. And as long as they aren't exposed to extreme sun or extreme drying winds, which I don't think you get a whole lot of those in Cordova, you're going to get roots on them and they're going to root themselves. I've literally taken current cuttings and first thing in the spring when the soil's soft, I'll stick them in the ground, probably 2/3 of the woody material underground, if not more. And usually I'll get probably 80% of them to root just on their own by watering them once or twice during the summer, as long as they don't dry out. But again, softwood cuttings, they take a special environment, they take a humid environment, usually some supplemental misting. They usually need something antifungal and they have to collect at the right time. But you can turn over more plants and more quickly can you establish plants by doing softwood cutting. So that's kind of the trade-off. So if you want to start with cuttings, I would start with hardwood cuttings, softwood cuttings. I'm still new working on that one myself, but the people who do it, it's usually the professionals are employing softwood cuttings. So, and again, my experience so far, all of our currants and gooseberry species do great with both styles of cuttings, and high bush cranberries do really well with actually both, but especially the hardwood cuttings. So, any questions so far?
I got a question.
Absolutely.
Do you ever just put cuttings in water or like water with willow?
So, so the key to that is if you have 6 leaves on it, you don't want to basically leave all of those 6 leaves on there because you don't want full leaves. So that's where you basically reduce the surface area. You want to basically leave just that little bottom third of the leaf attached to the top. And then they stick it in the media. And because it's actively growing when you remove it from the mother plant, it's then ready to root into the media. So the key to that is if you have 6 leaves on it, you don't want full leaves. So that's where you basically reduce the surface area. You want a little bit of leaf material, but you don't want full leaves. So that's where you basically reduce the surface area. You want a little bit of leaf material, but you don't want full leaves. So that's where you basically reduce the surface area. You want a little bit of leaf material, but you don't want full leaves. So that's where you basically reduce the surface area. You want a little bit of leaf material, but you don't want full leaves. So that's where you basically reduce the surface That is absolutely an
Yeah.
option, and so it's not something I have a whole lot of experience with. I've done with like our native willows, of course. Um, as long as like, and I know there's a gentleman up in Fairbanks who does it with grapes, and he actually adds hydrogen peroxide to the water, which actually helps create more oxygen or whatever. I guess it helps with the rooting process. Um, the only thing is I don't usually pay close enough attention, and then the water ends up kind of getting grimy. So if I know with some species they will readily root in water, so that would be a worthy of experiment. The only thing with just like the softwood cuttings, if you're doing them in water, you're going to have to kind of slowly acclimate them to soil-based media, keep them moist, and make sure they don't get exposed to too much sun too quickly. But beyond that, it's definitely worthy of experimentation, and especially if you change out that water and keep introducing oxygen, I don't see why it wouldn't work. So. But again, my experience is kind of limited. It's only with willows, pretty much. Does that
Thanks.
answer your question? Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll go on to the next slide if no other questions. This is my meat and potatoes. I absolutely love seed propagation because while cultivars are awesome, that beautiful gray currant that you have may be the most beautiful one in all of Cordova, and everybody in your neighborhood wants it, which is wonderful. So cuttings and layering, and everybody propagates it. But then you have one pest that comes in, and let's just say this one cultivar is just really susceptible to this pest. Then you basically have a monoculture of one cultivar. It comes in and wipes out the entire population. I think genetic diversity is really important when it comes to growing some of our native species. Whether because it may not be like you plant blueberry after blueberry or gray currant after gray currant, and they're seedlings, you may not notice a huge amount of difference from plant to plant because they're pure species, but they are genetically their own unique individual. They may have like resistances that the other one doesn't. They may have differences in berry appearance and size and flavor. They may have differences in hardiness and in adaptation. And so I think the key is like, hey, cool, that beautiful gray currant may be wonderful, but I think we should be growing a bunch of seedlings as well because that genetic diversity, Alaska's weather is crazy as is, and it's getting crazier. I think it's important for us to like grow that genetic diversity because that helps us weather whatever comes our way even better. And again, genetic diversity, that is spreading seeds out, and you're basically just promoting a more diverse and abundant ecosystem around you as well. So I love growing plants from seed. The problem is from seed, it takes a long time. It's one of those where it can be meticulous, people think it's slow, and it can be slow. But at the same time, we talked about how you can remove 3 feet of that gray currant or that stink currant, you could end up getting 6 to 8 cuttings out of the deal. If you take one long branch and pin it along the ground and you put moss over it, you end up with one bush. Well, I pick one berry and you could end up with anywhere between 10, 30, potentially 50 plants from that one berry. So the thing is like, and also by growing a berry, you're not taking from the native plant at all. The native plant is continuing to grow and do its thing. You're just creating more of the native plants. So I kind of like that lens. Again, is there a place for cuttings and layering? Absolutely. But it comes to my favorite, seedlings are always my favorite from the diversity perspective. And also I'm trying to tread the least I have to within the ecosystem to produce more. So that's why it's kind of my meat and potatoes. When it comes to like growing ours from seed, there are differences when it comes to like if you want to grow the early blueberries, Vaccinium ovalifolium, which I'm assuming is probably your main species you have over in Cordova, the high bush blueberries or huckleberries. The thing is like if you order seeds online from Washington, they're going to be dried. So that's going to be a different process than if you just collect fresh berries from your yard and you want to propagate more of them. So fresh berries, the seeds are already hydrated. You don't have to like water's already the embryo. You can soak them for a little bit, but once you remove the seeds from the berries, they're ready to be employed in stratification right then and there. If you order dried seeds in from another location, or like let's say you have a buddy in Yakutat that has just a beautiful blueberry and you want to grow them in Cordova, they'd probably send you dried seeds. You would have to rehydrate the seeds. So that's where I'd soak them in water for a minimum of 12 to 24 hours. Make sure the water has permeated through the seed to the embryo to begin the biological clock. Because if the seed is dry, let's say you just immediately plant it and the water doesn't reach the embryo, stratification doesn't start. The biological clock never starts. That hormone that's keeping the seed dormant, basically telling it needs to go through winter. If water hasn't reached the embryo, that process hasn't even started. So in the spring, you'll still just have a seed that's sitting there. The water has to reach the embryo to rehydrate the embryo to start that biological clock. So if you have dried seeds, you have to rehydrate them. If you have fresh seeds, that process has already been done by nature. So when it comes to fresh berries, though, again, that's like in that picture, that's Vaccinium alaskans, I believe. So the Alaska blueberry, that beautiful picture is from Sitka. I think they call them black huckleberries down there. Um, so for those berries, I have probably 150 plants growing from these berries in my nursery in Chugiak in little 3.5 inch pots. And all I did was I took those berries, I brought them in a Ziploc bag, I brought them home. You could absolutely freeze them if you want to, because freezing, while it doesn't necessarily help the seed germinate, it doesn't harm them. They're meant to freeze just like here in Alaska. But the seeds really want that magic Goldilocks zone between 33 and 40 degrees. So basically, in the late fall and breakup, that's their window when they're going to reach that threshold that starts diminishing the hormone. So basically, so those berries, I would want to extract the seeds. You could absolutely, at that point, you can go mash this berries, you can extract the seeds. But if you've ever tried doing that, blueberry seeds are really small and it's kind of a pain. And so, mind you, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but I'm also inherently lazy and I like kind of maximizing the amount of seeds I can process with the amount of time I have. So that's where I employ what's called the blender method. So you have to remember seeds that are fully dormant, that are saturated all the way through the embryo, they're dense. They're not going to float in water. They're going to sink in the water column. But the thing is the seeds, when they're in the berry, they're not going to sink in the water column because there's sugars, there's air pockets, there could be bugs in the berry. So a lot of times some berries will sink, some will float. And so the seeds never have the opportunity to separate in the water column. But the beauty is, if you basically take a blender, unfortunately, I usually would do an actual display or a demonstration of this. I did not bring my blender or my berries today. So unfortunately, you're gonna have to imagine with me. Maybe one day I'll be able to travel out to Cordova and show. But there's lots of YouTube videos as well. But what I would do is then basically I would take a blender, I would add 1 part berries to 4 to 5 parts water. So you're filling it up. So you have a little layer of berries at the bottom, fill it up with water, and then I'd blend it. The seeds are small, so the blender is not going to hurt seeds on the blueberry. Other species like your high bush cranberry, if you do it, it's definitely going to chew up the seeds. Species like salmonberry, you could do it for probably 3 to 5 seconds before the seeds start getting damaged. But and then things like your native crab apples, the blender method isn't going to work. But with blueberries, the seeds are so small that the blender's not going to hurt them. You blend it up, and you're going to see it looks like almost like a psychedelic lava lamp. You'll just see you'll see the seeds, you'll see the pulp, you'll see like the anthocyanin antioxidants and the pigmentation just circulating. And then you'll notice as the water spin starts slowing down, you'll start seeing bits sink to the bottom really quick, and you'll start seeing a layer of like film and pulp start floating at the top. If you do it and after like 10-15 seconds, it just looks like a smoothie. It means there's not enough water. You have to add a little more water. But if you do it and see everything separated out, it means you did it right. And you sit there, let everything separate out. And by the time you stop seeing movement, you remember those seeds are dense. They're not going to just float in the water unless they're duds or they have air in the embryo. So all of your mature seeds have sunk to the bottom of the water column. At the top, what you have is you have remnants of bugs, you have pulp, you have film, you have sugars and yeast. They're all sitting there at the top. You don't need any of that to germinate the berries. So that's where I would take the blender, I would go over to a slop bucket, and I'd pour off all of that pulp at the top and probably 2/3 of the water. Because you have to remember, just like gold panning, the goods are sank to the bottom, especially if you agitated them properly. Once you've poured off a good portion of your water and all the pulp that's at the top, you add some more fresh water and you repeat the process. You'll notice every time you do it, the water will get clearer, there will be less pulp, and by the time you do 3, 5, 7 water changes, you'll have nothing but beautiful seeds at the bottom. And fun fact, the native blueberries, the seeds are golden. And so it's kind of neat. It's almost like gold at the bottom of your gold pan, but it's blueberry seeds. So if you do that after multiple changes, you will end up with just a layer of beautiful native blueberry seeds at the bottom. And at that point, you're ready to begin stratification. The blender method, again, works great for all the vaccinium species. So your low bush cranberries, your bog cranberries, high bush blueberries, low bush blueberries, huckleberries. It works great for all those. If you're down in Southeast Alaska, it works great for salal. Anything that has really small seeds that won't be chewed up by the blender method works great. It also works great for all of our raspberry species because we talked about like scarification. All raspberries, whether they are your cloudberries or your nagoon berries or your salmon berries, they're meant to be travel through animals and get deposited. So they have a really hard outer seed coat called the endocarp. The blender method actually helps you nick that outer seed coat. So while you're not force feeding your bear friend a bunch of salmon berries, you can kind of replicate that process by blending the berries with water, and the seed, basically the blender will help nick the seed coat and help water break through that impermeable like endocarp and enter the embryo and begin the basically the biological clock. So the blender method it's multifunction. You're cleaning the seeds, but you may actually be helping nick them and help scarify them so they're ready for the stratification. So with seeds, though, like we talked about, your favorite blueberry plant, if they all fall in the same spot and they germinate, you will have a beautiful patch of blueberries until you don't. Some sort of event comes in and wipes out an entire genetic population of blueberries. So and so we talked about scarification and moving the plants elsewhere, but also those plants, they know wherever those berries fall or wherever they're deposited, if they germinate in the fall, they ripen in August or September. If they germinate right then and there, they won't have enough time to basically finish their growth cycle and go dormant. So then we basically simulate the stratification. So that period we talked about in the late fall or the early spring, not necessarily the frozen period in between. So to overcome that stratification, it's actually super easy. All those fresh berry seeds that you have at the bottom of your blender, what you're going to do is you're going to pour off all the excess water. You could scoop the seeds out with a spoon if you want. I try not to handle them too much because I don't want to introduce like full mold or fungi, whatever I've been touching on surfaces. And I put them in a Ziploc baggie. That's where you can mix in sand, you can mix in perlite. I like peat moss. I know peat moss is kind of, it's not the most sustainable, but it's great for at least stratification purposes. And then what you do is you put the seeds in there, you put your peat moss, and then basically toss everything together. Because the peat moss, the upside to peat moss is it's antimicrobial and it helps inhibit or at least delay the onset of molds and things like that. But so basically, you're creating a barrier around each seed. So by tossing it around, you're basically encapsulating each seed in like a coat of peat moss. So even if one seed ends up spoiling, it had a little too much sugar, or it had some sort of fungal inoculation, and it starts basically molding, or a fungus starts colonizing it, because it's coated in peat moss, that mold will probably not make it to the seed next to it. So it kind of contains whatever pathogen or whatever microbe or fungal ailment is there. It will contain it so it doesn't spoil all your seeds. So I toss them in the peat moss. We remember that the embryo has to stay moist. You don't want it to dry out during stratification. So that's where you don't want it to be in dry peat moss. You want it to be in moist peat moss, but also you don't want to be putting it in a bog. So what I would do is basically, once I toss them together, I'll add a little bit of water and then I squeeze. And when the water stops dripping out of the peat moss, that's when I know I have an adequate level of moisture. And then I toss it, fluff it up again. I seal the Ziploc bag. I label it. At least I say I label it. I'm actually really bad about labeling it. But label the date, label the species, and like when you're putting it in stratification, and then that little baggie just goes in the crisper drawer of your fridge, and it will sit there for a lot of our native blueberries. 2 to 3 months is perfectly adequate, and they will germinate at almost 80 to 90% after that 3 months once you remove them from that cold period in your refrigerator. It works great for low bush cranberries, bog cranberries, Saskatoons, native crab apples. All these species, you give them the 2 to 3 months of cold stratification in the fridge, they're ready to germinate. Because when you remove them from that baggie, you take the baggie. Usually, how I run a germination test is I'll take that baggie of peat moss and everything after 3 months. I pull it out of the fridge and I put it on the counter. Leave it there for 2 weeks. If the berries are ready, the seeds are ready, they'll start germinating in the bag, and that'll tell you that, hey, the window has been met. If you go to do that and nothing germinates, maybe you've only left them for 90 days, and maybe they wanted 95 days. Each seed will be unique. So you just put it back in the fridge for a couple weeks, pull them out, and you're going to get germination each time. So that's the key when it comes to stratification. And then when it comes to germination, it's basically, once you see that there's signs of germination, you could then, the easiest way I go about it is I'll fill up a pot with like sphagnum peat moss or Pro Mix, and then I take the layer of like peat moss and seeds that have been stratifying in the fridge, and I just kind of sprinkle it over the top and water it in, just creating a very thin layer. And then the seedlings will all grow together. And once they're large enough, I'll pluck them out individually and put them in trays. I'll take care of them, give them a little bit of diluted fish emulsion, put them under grow lights, and they grow really well. The blueberries that I germinated from like Girdwood and from Whittier, I collected them back in August. They germinated. I started them in early November, and all the plants are about 3 inches tall now. So they get going pretty quickly once, and I just transplanted them all into plug trays. So I wish I would have brought some with me as kind of a display. I wish I would have brought the strawberries as well, but unfortunately, I'm at work right now, so I wasn't able to bring those. But so I like the seeds. Is it a game of patience? Yes. Is it annoying that, okay, these seeds have to sit there for 3 months in the fridge, and then they may take 1 to 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks to germinate, and then it may take a couple months before the plants are large enough to pluck, and then it may be a couple years before they're ready to produce berries? Absolutely. But again, if you're willing to be patient in that game, again, that one gray currant you picked from the forest, it may produce the 10, 30, or 50 seedlings versus the cuttings. So you can do some of both if you want. But the thing is these are all options, but by growing them from seed, you get the most out of what you're collecting, and you're having the least impact on where you're collecting it from. So that's kind of why I like it. And the genetic diversity is always a win. So With proof of concept, I like showing folks that we're growing the species, and so we can discuss them a little bit more. But next slide, please. So I wanted proof of concept. These are the Vaccinium oleaginosum or bog blueberries. I'm assuming, do you guys have these in the muskeg areas in Cordova? Some people
Yeah.
call it, okay, alpine blueberries. So Vaccinium oleaginosum, it's one of the main species we have in this area. This is actually, if you want to grow one of our native berries from seed and you want one that's really forgiving, this is the one to do. The bog blueberries, like contrary to popular belief, like these grow like little weeds. You start them, you give them, again, same thing, you process the berries, you extract the seeds, you stratify them for 60 to 90 days, you pull them out within 7 to 10 days, they all germinate, and by the time they're a month old, they're already 2 to 3 inches tall. And then you let them grow. And the cool thing about this is you see those little plugs that are on the right hand side. Those plugs are only 6 months old, and you see they already have branches and they're already expanding out. What's cool about them is that basically by starting them indoors early, the plants basically, because outside they may germinate, they may only grow half an inch that first year, another inch the second year. So you're looking at a plant that may take 5, 10 years before it ever produces a berry. But by starting them indoors, they love being treated to room temperature conditions and stable environment. The plants basically, you grow them, you transplant them, they will grow a couple inches tall and set a terminal bud, and then they'll just sit there for 2 weeks. You're like, oh, is that it? Is it done? And then what's kind of cool is after 2 weeks, it's almost like the bog blueberry is like, oh, I see what you're doing. And then suddenly there will be these little shoots that come from the cotyledon right at the base, that first leaf that comes out of the seed. And suddenly more branches come out, and those will grow instead of terminal bud. And then if there's enough time still, it'll do it again and it'll do it again. You can almost see every growth season that would happen naturally outside, but you can see it happening over the months of starting them indoors. So if you have a single grow light in your house, this is a great way to get yourself through the winter. And fun fact, you can literally do this with your frozen blueberries you have right now. If you do them from berries just right out of the freezer, you'll probably get 10 to 20% germination. If you give them some cold stratification, you'll probably up that value up to 80. But literally from frozen berries, you could sow those seeds right now and you'll get some to germinate. So fun fact. But that's what we're coming to learn, where in 6 months, the plants that I have there on the right are already larger than probably the 20, 30, 50-year-old plant that I have right there in the alpine that I took the berries from. So it's one of those where we can really expedite the timeline by starting them indoors. Could you absolutely go find a log or a bog within your property and go mash berries on top of them and let Alaska do the work? Absolutely. I'm just inherently an impatient person, and I don't know if I have 20 years to watch them come and go, but by doing this, we can almost be putting a 3 to 5 year old plant outdoors by just starting them in the middle of the winter and letting them grow inside our house. And then you transplant them, they'll probably put on another flush of growth once you transplant them. And if you give them any water, any azalea fertilizer, any mulch, they will just grow that much happier. So the plants we plant out in the spring are the equivalent of 3 to 5 year old plants that would naturally occur. So that's the upside to starting some of these plants indoors. It doesn't have to be done that way. It's just how I do it. So next slide, please. So the Vaccinium oleaginosum is one of the easiest, and it's one of the ones that I think everybody could be doing. This happens to be one of my favorites. Do you guys have the dwarf huckleberries in Cordova? Maybe up high? Have you guys seen them? Okay. I only see them occasionally on this side of the Chugach, usually up high. Usually people don't even notice them because they're kind of inconspicuous. The plants are smaller than the oleaginosum, but they have a very distinctive round flower scar. The plants are often no taller than like 6 inches tall, but the berries are sweeter than any of our other species. And so as a kid in Fairbanks, this was like my bucket list plan of what I wanted to grow or what I want to plant someday. Because pictures like that on the left, I took that picture at Hatcher Pass. I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's more berries than plant there. And I remember seeing a picture with Verna Pratt in Alaska Wildflowers, and her picture for the plant looked just like that. I'm like, how are there more berries than plant? So the first time I found this plant up at Hatcher Pass, I'm pretty sure I made an excited banshee squeal. I was really excited, and I collected the berries. And so those plants in my right hand were like a childhood dream of growing those. And now I grow them every year, and it's so satisfying because it's one of those niche blueberries that I don't think many people even know grow here. And by following the process, they germinate the same as all of our others. And it's one of those where we may not be growing fields of these anytime soon, but they're beautiful ground cover. I think these have a lot of application in our landscapes, and especially as a low growing element. And so it's really fun to experiment with these. So next slide, please. I'm willing to bet that this is probably the primary species you guys have in Cordova, the high bush blueberries, the Vaccinium ovale. So again, same thing. You start these ones early. You give them the 90 days cold stratification, and they germinate. These ones are a little interesting in the fact that we talked about the bog blueberries, and they germinate after 7 to 10 days. These guys, you have to be a little more patient. These may take anywhere 2.5 to 4 weeks. But you basically sow them and just keep them moist, and within a month you should see signs of life. If you don't, it just means they probably need a little more cold. So these guys require a little more patience. They're not the ones that, like, if you're kind of wary of starting berries from seed, this is probably not the first one to try, but they will grow. They're a little slower too, especially the plants, especially when they get going. They by their 1 month birthday versus the bog blueberries that may be 3 inches tall. These are going to be maybe a quarter to a third of an inch tall. But by the time they're 2 months old, they'll probably be 3 inches tall. Once they get going, they actually go pretty quickly. But it's you have to be a lot more patient initially. But once these get going, it's kind of cool because you notice those little seedlings on the right hand side. The leaves don't match at all the parent plant over there on the left. That parent plant's in Girdwood along Crow Pass Road. And what's kind of cool, and this is my theory, I could be wrong. I'd love to hear other thoughts on this one. But if you ever find these blueberries, the little seedlings growing in the understory, the leaves are completely different than the parent plants. It's almost like they're little evergreens. And you'll notice in the spring, they don't always lose their leaves. A lot of times they will keep their leaves and then they just start growing again. My theory is that these plants almost go through plant puberty. When they're younger, I think that they're evergreen, basically meant to collect snow on top of them and sandwich them against the ground to be protected while they're young and fragile. And then the plants kind of go through this weird stage of plant puberty where suddenly it spits a branch out and has the giant soft leaves that are then deciduous. And what's fun is these plants, like again, on a nurse log in Cordova, berries get deposited. They could grow year after year, and it may be only a centimeter to half an inch per year they go. And they may have 10 years before they ever hit plant puberty and start producing the big deciduous leaves. But what's cool is when you do them indoors, they'll do just like the bog blueberries, where they'll grow and you'll basically get a flush of growth, terminal bud, and then they'll basically wait a couple weeks and start growing again. And then suddenly, just out of nowhere, one branch will grow three times longer than all the others, and it'll have giant round leaves. It's almost like the plant's like, I'm a big plant now, and it basically is like, I'm going to be deciduous, and that one branch will then grow vigorously upward and will have big leaves. It's almost like the plant it's like, I am established enough, I'm ready to survive above the snow line, and it produces the big deciduous leaves. But it's really neat. This is something that could happen over years naturally outside, but when you grow them indoors, you get to see this just happen in your flat of blueberries. So just a neat little gee whiz bit of information. So next slide, please. So I talked about basically the entire process for stratification and how to grow all these blueberries. Hey, that's my process right there. And if you guys want, I can send this to you guys if you guys want to take pictures. By no means is this the only way. This is just my way. So this is what I can speak to and what has worked for me. But basically everything we just covered, it's right here. And it works great for all of our native blueberries, our low bush cranberries, bog cranberries. And then it works really well for like thimbleberries. I know thimbleberries don't quite make it up to Cordova, but down in Southeast, it works great for them. You could also use this for Saskatoons. I've even used this for some Nagoons and had pretty good success. So there are other options, but most of those species, you employ this process and it works really well. So, and you can also employ this with the native beach strawberries. As I found out with Scott, he brought me some frozen beach strawberries from Cordova. You can absolutely stratify them like this and germinate them, or you could just take the frozen berries, blend them up, extract the seeds, put them in peat moss, and put them on the counter, and they'll germinate within 2 to 3 months. So I don't know if those ones absolutely need the cold stratification. No seeds are really going to be hurt by cold stratification. It helps some of them germinate in higher numbers. So next slide, please.
I got a question. When you
Absolutely.
say, harden them off, plant them outside, what type of environment? I mean, if I just stick them in any random soil that's sitting outside my door, is that gonna work?
So it's going to depend on the species. We know blueberries, they like rich soil that's like rich in organic material and usually fairly acidic in nature. So I would try to replicate that the best I can. So here in this area, we don't have an abundance of conifer forests. The bark beetles kind of did in most of those. So when I tell people to plant blueberries here, I tell them to amend their native soil with sphagnum peat moss, or you can bury some spruce logs and maybe put some peat moss in the planting hole. Always mulch. I always use a bunch of like spruce mulch or spruce wood chip mulch, or if you know where a squirrel has been depositing all the cone shingles, you can use some of that. Things like salmonberries and nagoonberries, they are not as picky. They will grow in most soil as long as they have access to nutrients. But with the blueberries, most of the vaccinium species, I try to at least amend if it's not inherently like full of sphagnum peat moss and not full of like rotten logs, I try to amend it to replicate those conditions relatively. So I'll mix in peat moss with native soil at least 50 by 50, and then just a bunch of like chipped up spruce or spruce needles or something like that. Usually that does the trick. And then if you see signs like the leaves start getting kind of yellowish or unhappy, you can absolutely acidify your soil by using elemental sulfur or a soil acidifier. You could also just use azalea fertilizer, which works really well. So I would definitely, again, peat, at the very least, when you go to plant them, I would just mix a little bit of peat moss into the planting hole and some wood chip mulch, and usually they'll be pretty happy with that. But if you try to replicate the conditions you find in nature with your garden bed, they'll be that much happier. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I have a question. With the salmon berries, I hear
Absolutely.
that salmon berries are mainly coastal. Can you bring the seeds and propagate it on a non-coastal area? Or
So what I'll say is, salmonberries are primarily a coastal species, but they are actually listed as an occasional species on the south side of Denali State Park. So they do actually grow inland. I think the big impact there is there's a lot of upslope moisture that rolls up the Susitna Valley, so I think that's part of it. They like moisture. So being on the rain shadow of the Chugach on this side of the mountains, I grow them in Chugiak. Some areas of my property they do really well. Other areas, like I have a lot of seedlings going, and some places down by my creek where it's wet, the canes will grow 4 feet tall and then in a bad winter die back halfway. Then I have other ones up on my slope where they may only get 2 feet tall because there's not as much soil moisture, but they don't die back at all and I get lots of blossom. So I think that they do benefit from snow cover if you're not necessarily in that nice coastal moist area, and they also like moist soil. So if you're not in specifically a coastal area, by putting them in a moist area, mulching the ground, and making sure they get snow cover, they're worthy of trial. I had some people even take them up to Fairbanks to try just because they have a reliable snow cover. Will they do anything up there? We won't really know for a little bit, but I feel like I'm kind of pushing them where I'm at here in Anchorage. But so far, most of the seedlings we've grown from Girdwood and planted in the Anchorage are at least surviving to the crown. And then from the success beyond that is just going to vary from site to site. So I'll also say like planting them around my property in different elevations, different soil level, moisture levels, by growing a bunch of seedlings, try different spots. And I think you'll find success at least somewhere, or at least that's part of the experiment.
awesome, thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Any more questions? Okay. So this one was actually fun because this was trying to figure out, basically I collected a bunch of cloudberries. I know some people call them lowbush salmonberries. I know the folks in Cordova would probably argue what a proper salmonberry is. I'll definitely direct all of that argument to the folks in Bethel. But this is yeah, the great salmonberry debate. Both are salmonberries for all I'm concerned. These are also known as uppick cloudberries, baked appleberries. And so, or Rubus chamemorus. And so this is very much a boreal species, grows up north. I'm assuming you probably find them in some of the muskeg bogs down there or up high. Here we find them in black spruce bogs. This was one of those where I collected a bunch of berries in a black spruce bog in Anchorage. I'm like, I want to germinate these. And I looked online and there's no information. They're like, yeah, maybe they need to be scarified. Maybe they need to be stratified. We don't really know. There was one researcher in Scandinavia that's like, oh yeah, if you take the seed and you clip the hard endocarp off, and you plant that, then it'll germinate. So the seeds on the uppick or the cloudberries, they're large, but they're not that large. And then there was Josh here who's trying to like clip the outer seed coat off. And I'm seeing here 10 minutes later, I have nothing but a mangled seed and pieces of seed all over my hand. I didn't get the embryo out. And then I look at my bowl of a couple thousand seeds next to me. I'm like, this isn't it. And I'm like, okay, well, what would happen in nature? What would happen with these berries? And I was like, okay, well, animals are a means of distribution. So it means they probably need to be scarified. Basically a bear or a bird is probably going to distribute them. So I was like, well, I don't have any bear or bird friends. So, and I don't necessarily, I don't know if I'm necessarily, it's within my morals to force feed my chickens the cloudberries. It's an option, something to look into. So I'm like, okay, well, let's assume this berry just sat there and rotted on its own. It wasn't eaten by an animal. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to put the berries in a bag with themselves. They're acidic. I'm going to let them soak in the bag, and I'm just going to put them in the fridge and let them sit there for a week or two. Well, I forgot because my ADHD is notorious for that. And I found the berries a month later, and they were bubbling, and it was disgusting. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I definitely let those go too long. Yikes. I'm like, okay, well, I picked these in July. It is now August, and I still like, okay, well, what would happen in the bog? Well, it's August. It's still relatively mild in the Anchorage area. We're not expecting any hard freezes until the end of September. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to extract the seeds. I'm going to use the blender method. I used the blender method, extracted the seeds, which actually probably helps basically nick the seed coats. With the cloudberries, within 3 cycles of the water in the blender, they were all clean seeds. And I was like, okay, well, the seeds are probably still hard. I nicked them. I don't know if there's even water to the embryo yet. I'm going to put them in a cup of water and let them soak overnight. Maybe just help them soften up a little bit. I forgot them. So 2 days later, I was like, oh gosh, these sat for way too long. Okay, cool. Well, it's still August. It won't freeze until the end of September here in Anchorage. I'm going to put these in warm stratification. I'm going to mix them in sphagnum peat moss, and they're just going to sit there, and they're going to sit at roughly room temperature until then. If you wanted even more accurate, you could put it outside where there's ups and downs and maybe some cool nights and some warm days. I just put them on the counter out of the sun, and I let them warm stratify. I thought I was just going to do it until the end of September because I was like, well, that would be accurate to the conditions in Anchorage. I did that, and the theme with Josh, I forgot about them. I found them under a bunch of stuff. It was the end of October, so it wasn't too bad. But I was like, oh, damn, these have been here way too long. And I was like, well, it's definitely winter in the world of these cloudberries. So I took the cloudberries in the bag, put them in the crisper drawer of the fridge to employ the cold stratification. So end of October, and then right at New Year's, I decided that, hey, I'm just going to pull them out and see what happens, not expecting a single thing to happen. Within a week, there were little radicals showing. It wasn't many. That first round, there was probably 25 to 50 that germinated, but I could not believe it because like there was no literature on germinating these, and we had just cracked the code, at least to some extent. I was like, well, this is definitely beginner's luck. This isn't something that's going to repeat. I basically was like, okay, well, no more germinate. So the best chance of getting more to germinate is put them in the fridge. They sat in there for 60 roughly days. Maybe they need 65 days. Maybe they need 90 days. So I put them in for another month. I pulled them out. I had hundreds germinate. I pulled out all the ones that germinated, put them in plug trays, put the rest back in the fridge. Third time, had hundreds more germinate. I realized more that they liked the cycles, and each time you put them in the fridge and pulled them out and put them in the fridge, you were meeting basically more of the seeds were checking off their requirements in order to germinate. By May, we germinated almost 100%. And so this process that we're going to share afterwards, we've literally sent it out to the department. There were some researchers with the Department of Agriculture in Canada that requested these instructions. I did a news interview with a newscast over in Newfoundland. And the thing is like we stumbled upon a process to germinate a berry that up until this point really hadn't been germinated. So it was really quite the accomplishment. It's really exciting. And now this is one. And basically that one year I was like, maybe it's a fluke. We've replicated these instructions every year, and the success has been resounding every time. So the cloudberries, we're now germinating them. And fun fact, those little seedlings you see right there, you germinate them, they'll sit there and they'll sit at that stage for probably 6 to 8 weeks. But by the time they're about 2 to 2.5 months old, you'll start seeing little rhizomes pop up in the pot because you can see the roots are developing underneath, and then they start suckering in the pot. So it's becoming a little patch of cloudberries. And what's cool about that is each of those, they're dioecious. So one may be a male, one may be a female. You need both for seedlings. They become a little patch. You plant 5 of those together, you're probably going to get a male and a female together. They'll sucker together, and you'll end up with a beautiful patch of cloudberries that will probably result in cross pollination and berries. I don't know how long it'll take to produce berries. We're still figuring that out, but we've cracked the first code of getting them to germinate. So it was a fun experiment. Next slide, please. So salmon berries. This is one of my favorites. And so basically when everything, that entire process, all of Josh's forgetting the seeds and all that, just basically I'm repeat myself, apply that to the salmonberries because these salmonberries were in the bag next to the cloudberries, and the same things like verbatim happened. I just picked the salmonberries in Girdwood. And same thing, I forgot about them. They fermented in their bag. I blended them. I forgot them in the cup of water. I forgot them on the counter, put them in the fridge. And when I pulled the cloudberries out, I pulled the salmonberries out. Unlike the cloudberries that had 25 to 50 germinate in that first batch, I pulled the salmonberries out, not a single one of them. I'm like, okay, so that wasn't it. I'm like, well, I'm putting the cloudberries back in the fridge. Why not try the salmonberries? Well, I did that. And after a month, I pulled both of them out. And while I had hundreds of cloudberries germinate, I started having salmonberries germinate. It was a couple dozen that first time. It wasn't very many, but I realized I'm like, okay, maybe they just need a little more cold or they need a little more warm. But now we're starting to meet those parameters. So pulled out all those seedlings, transplanted them into plug trays, and then put the rest of the seeds back in the fridge. A month later, had way more germinate. And I was really excited. By spring, I probably had 40 to 50% of the salmon berries germinate. They grow ridiculously fast. That little seedling you see there in the middle, that's maybe 2 months old. They grow. If they're happy, they're happy. So don't start them in November. You'll have a 3 foot tall salmon berry plant. They're definitely ones to start March-ish if you start them early. But that's when I started. I was like, oh, cool. I cracked the code on both cloudberries and salmon berries. And the next year, I went to do the salmon berries. And after all of the process of putting them, basically pulling them from the fridge, putting back in the fridge, I had a total of 12 germinate. I'm like, ooh, I don't know what I changed, but that wasn't it. The third year I did that, and I had a total of 2 germinate. I'm like, okay, salmonberries, you still have some secrets. I'm not quite sure what they are. But you notice that picture on the right-hand side. This is where Josh found out Alaska does it better than Josh. That second year I had the berries and I had a total of 12 germinate. The leftover material, Mike, well, it's peat moss and seeds. It's at least compost. I took them and I dumped them in a garden bed. I forgot about them because I'm like, these are irrelevant. They're not going to germinate. Well, of course, and in my typical fashion, did I label the spot? Did I tell, like, in any way make note of what I dumped there? No, not at all, because I didn't plan ahead. I just dumped all the seeds in a spot and moved on with my ADHD world. Well, the next spring, there was an eruption of seedlings in this little corner of my garden bed, and I could not figure it out. I was looking at the cotyledons, I was looking at the seeds, and I'm like, I have no idea. These kind of look like hemp nettle seedlings, but they're not clustered like what I'd expect out of a rodent. And I had to let them grow, and I started seeing the true leaves form. I'm like, that looks like rubus. That looks like salmon berries. And I let them grow, and I'm like, oh my gosh. I pulled up the seed, and I found like a little seed casing that had been expelled from the endocarp. I pulled it up and I looked at it closely with a magnifying glass, and there's these little pits on the seed that are telltale salmon berries. I'm like, these are salmon berries. Wow. And so come to find out, if you take salmon berries and mash them into the dirt, they just germinate the following spring. And if you have frozen salmon berries, you can literally mash them into the dirt. They won't germinate that first year, they germinate the second year. So can you do it indoors? This last year I did it indoors. I gave them a little more warm on the front end and a little more cold, and I had way more germination. So I think that playing with the numbers of warm and cold and fermentation, I think those values, I think the recipe's there, but we have not honed in on it exactly yet. So this is where I employ you guys. If you guys want to try playing around with salmon berries, let me know what works best, because we're still kind of figuring out the perfect recipe. But as of now, the perfect recipe is mash them in your garden beds and they're going to germinate. I learned from a lady
Don't
in
want to plant salmon berries.
It's funny
I'm pulling them out of my garden.
it's
They're
funny
the weed.
it's funny you say that, because in Anchorage with my nursery, over 40% of the sales of the nursery are salmon berries.
Oh, wow.
They're by far the most sought after berry here in Anchorage. But then in Kodiak, they laughed at me when they're like, "You're growing salmon berries?" I'm like, "Yes, I'm growing salmon berries." Like, I don't think I could pay people to get rid of salmon berries in Kodiak. So you cannot throw a rock anywhere on the archipelago and not hit a salmonberry bush. And so it was just it's interesting how much it varies from region to region. But here in South Central, on this side of the mountains, salmon berries are by far the most sought after. And so blueberries a little bit, nagoonberries, no, salmonberries are it. And then when I go up to Fairbanks, it's the cloudberries and the bog blueberries that are the big seller. So it varies from region to region. But it's and then you guys will actually probably appreciate this in Cordova as their weeds. A woman in Kodiak, she had freezer bags of salmon berries that they never made anything into, and so she thought, okay, well, compost. So she dumped them in her garden bed in the summer. Nothing happened. That next spring, nothing happened, and then 2 years later, she had an eruption of seedlings. Like her whole garden bed, it just looked like chickweed, but salmonberry edition. And literally the next 5 years, she was fighting salmonberry seedlings. Like she was like, I cannot complain enough about these. These are the worst weed on the planet. I'm like, you mix the seeds into your garden bed, and Alaska did Alaska things. So fun fact: if you frozen berries, you're probably not going to germinate that first spring, but the second spring you'll have an eruption of seedlings. But that was so, and then that does, like, if you want to do this with nagoonberries or with the trailing raspberries or thimbleberries, it works for all of them. So to talk a little bit about, so just like the blueberries, next slide, please. So that's the process. That's what we've employed for most of our rubus species. And I know in parentheses it says the verdict is out for the trailing raspberries, the rubus pedatus. No, we have confirmed that they will germinate with this process. So again, this is not any perfect recipe. This is not like the say all be all. This is just my process that has worked. And these are the instructions I sent to researchers in Canada. And it just kind of felt like major imposter syndrome when you have these scientists who are like, hey, what's your process? I'm like, yeah, guys, I forgot the bag of berries in my fridge and they fermented. But it's kind of cool because it's being replicated. There was a woman who lives along Hudson Bay in Canada who followed these instructions and she germinated cloudberries there. And now she's the talk of the town. So it has been replicated in other regions, and people are sending me pictures of the cloudberries and blueberries in accordance with these instructions. So that's my only ask. If you guys do end up growing some of these berries, please send me pictures on social media. I'd love to see them because it's really satisfying seeing people grow these native plants. So,
Question, you said this, I don't recognize all the names at the top. Is Nagoonberry one of these that works this way?
absolutely. Actually, and I would like to talk about the Nagoon real quick. So the Rubus chamemberus is the cloudberry, the Articus is the Nagoonberry, the Spectabilis is the salmonberry, and then the Pedatus is the trailing raspberry.
Okay.
So Nagoonberries, like the process we talked about, they will absolutely germinate with the warm and the cold. Some people say they only need cold. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But fun fact, if you just take Nagoonberries and mash them into the dirt, they germinate in the spring. So it's one of those where could you go through the fermentation and warm and cold and all that? Yes, absolutely. It's a whole lot of extra when Alaska does it better than me. So if you a lot of times when I mash berries, and so I call it the smash and plant method, it works great for all of our native ribes species. It works great for Saskatoons. It works great for highbush cranberries. If you take ripe berries and mash them into a garden, I would definitely either label the spot you do it or do it in a row. So when all these seedlings pop up in the spring, you're like, that was intentional for whatever reason. So you don't just rip them out as chickweed. But if you have a garden bed and you just mash ripe berries into your garden bed and let Alaska do the stratification, they will germinate either that first spring or the second spring. Things like highbush cranberries and Devil's Club, they take 2 years. A native mountain ash, they take 2 years. But things like Saskatoon, service berries, salmon berries, Nagoon berries, they all germinate. All of our native ribes species, the gray currants, they will all germinate that first spring afterwards. And if you do them in rows, they all germinate in a row, and you know it was intentional. So I think like the smash and plant method is probably the most approachable for a lot of folks. With blueberries, it's kind of they're slow to grow, so I usually advise people to start them indoors because you can get the 3 to 5 years worth of growth indoors under lights. But things like sandberries, they grow fast enough that a sandberry that germinates in the spring will be 3 inches tall by the fall, and the next year it'll be probably 8 to 12 inches tall, and then 4 feet the next year. So, but I know you guys don't want to grow them because they're weeds there. You guys can send me all the sandberries if you want, but but so that's the process I've employed for all the rubus species, and it's worked. But it's by no means is this the only way. If salmon berries or cloudberries only germinated via Josh's recipe that he made up on the go, they probably wouldn't be a circumpolar species that grows around the northern hemisphere. Or salmon berries up and down the coast from Japan to California. So this is not the only way. There's definitely other ways to go about it as well. So, any more questions on this one? Okay, I want to be conscientious of your guys' time, so make a couple friendly recommendations and take any questions, then we'll let you guys go. So these are some of just my haphazard recommendations based off of what I've seen. And again, it's not the only way. Again, I'd love to hear more experience once you guys have them. So basically, my recommendations for artificial versus natural stratification. So natural being you plant the berries, mash them. Always mash the berry first. If you leave them whole, the seeds sometimes don't get in contact with water, and the process doesn't start. So I'd mash the berry, create a pulp, and mash it into dirt. Artificial is like, hey, using the blender, extracting the seeds, and putting them in the fridge. So recommendations when it comes to artificial stratification and germination, highly recommend all of our all of our blueberries, our huckleberries, our low bush cranberries, our bog cranberries. I highly recommend doing those artificially. You have better control. They grow slower, so growing them over the winter, it's a great way to have a little bit of like a green pill when it's dark outside. And by the time you plant them out, they're 3 to 5 years old or the equivalent thereof in their size. Could you do it on a nurse log? Absolutely. It's just going to take quite a while because time is relative when you're a little vaccinium growing on a nurse log in Cordoba. When it comes to natural or artificial stratification, both will work adequately. That's where your highbush cranberries come in, your Saskatoons, your currants, your western crab apples, your salmonberry. Like we talked about, the salmonberry, could you get, in theory, 40-50% germination by starting them indoors and going through that process? Yes. But if you mash the berries into the dirt, they'll germinate too. So it's whatever your basically your threshold for inconvenience is or your threshold for patience is. That's an option. Same with Nagoonberries. It's one of those where both can be employed. You're just going to have a more advanced Nagoonberry if you started early and grow it under lights and then transplant it. Basically, you'll have a more advanced plant than if you just plant the berries and they go through the Alaska growing season. High bush cranberries, you mash the berries into the soil and they don't germinate the first spring, but they germinate the second spring. It's funny to me because high bush cranberries, like how Kodiak is with salmon berries, that's how we are with high bush cranberries up here in South Central. You cannot throw a rock anywhere in the forest here without hitting a high bush cranberry bush. So for me, I'm like, okay, well, these are probably not going to be the most sought after because everybody has access. But then in Kodiak, this is the one that they were just so excited. They're like, oh my gosh, we want to grow these. I didn't realize the Sitka black-tailed deer have kind of decimated the high bush cranberry stands. So again, just you'll notice that there's nuances. Some people want different species in different regions. Again, I probably would be broke if I was a salmonberry farmer in Cordova. So it's just relative from region to region. Things like Saskatoons, you plant them, they germinate all in the spring. And again, samberries are the same way. Species that I think prefer natural stratification, they just do it better outside. I grow Devil's Club with my nursery. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but with it being one of the most sacred plants to many indigenous people here, I think it's really relevant to grow it, especially when people over harvest it. So again, I tried planting berries. I've tried artificially doing it. I've never gotten Devil's Club to germinate artificially indoors. So I basically take Devil's Club, I take the berries, I mash them into the dirt. They don't germinate the first spring, but they germinate the second spring. But fun fact, if you find bear poop full of Devil's Club seeds, kind of taking advantage of like that mechanism of distribution, the scarification, if you take the bear poop, carefully collect it, mix it in water, and spread it over your garden soil, you're going to have Devil's Club seedlings pop up that first spring and second spring. And then whatever else the bear has eaten. I've found currants, I found watermelon berries, I found a whole plethora of native species popping up in bear poop. Mind you, little side note, I had some folks who were really excited about growing the bear poop, and they were like, yeah, I was giving a presentation in May in Anchorage, and these folks were so excited about the bear poop story. They're like, yeah, we collected bear poop and we planted it. I'm like, oh, when did you do that? And they're like, 2 weeks ago. I'm like, it's May. There's no seeds in it. Thank you for fertilizing your garden, but you did not plant any seeds. So make sure timing is important. But if you find bear poop full of seeds, it's sometimes a fun experiment just to see what the bear ate and you plant it. And I have found everything from the watermelon berries and the salmon berries and the Devil's Club to even invasive choke cherry. So it's interesting to learn what the berries are eating. And again, you can't ask for more local or more naturally collected berries than from Yogi the Bear. And so when it comes to natural stratification, planting these berries outside, mashing them in dirt, the smash and plant method, it works great for all of our ribes species. You plant them outside and Alaska does the work. And whatever germinates in the spring, as long as they don't dry out, they're okay to just keep growing there. There's no hardening off. There's no acclimating. They are just on Alaska's cycle, and whatever survives, survives. So with that, again, the big takeaway from this is there is no right one way to grow these. These species wouldn't be circumpolar species or grow up and down the coast if they only grew Josh's way. So with that, hopefully you can go out, if you have some frozen berries, go extract the seeds tonight or tomorrow or next year, go collect berries, purposely set them aside and play around with it. Because right now, if you don't have Nagoonberries, you don't have Nagoonberries. So collecting some Nagoonberries and trying to grow them, worst comes to worst, you still don't have Nagoonberries. But best case scenario, you now have a brand new patch of genetically diverse Nagoonberries, and you are going to be the talk of the town with all the beautiful berries. So with that, I hope you're all inspired to go out and go grow our native berries. Try the recipes, try different ratios, try different combinations. Because I think if we all work together and we all share this information real time, I think within the next couple of years, we'll really hone in on this and make it accessible to everybody. So with that, any questions?
Do you have cranberries? Do you sell cranberries?
Are you talking
Like
the low bush?
the lingonberries?
Absolutely, yeah.
Low bush.
I actually
Okay.
this last I collected a bunch of them up on Mount Baldy and Eagle River, and I think I transplanted. Oh gosh, I felt like I was transplanting low bush cranberries per day, but I filled 4 plug flats with them. So I have 200 low bush cranberries overwintering in 3.5-inch pots outside right now in Chugiak. And then I transplanted over 400 in the last week and a half. So it's one of those where a little sandwich baggie of low bush cranberries equates to hundreds of berry plants. So again, that's why I like growing them from seed. And those little plants, they take about a week and a half to start germinating. Same process as the bog blueberries. And by the time they're 2 months old, they're already 3 to 4 inches tall. And then they'll start setting up little rhizomes. I even think we found a hybrid between a low bush cranberry and a bog blueberry because there's intermediate characteristics between both parent plants. I don't know yet. I sent the pictures to Patricia Hallway up in Fairbanks, and so we're waiting to kind of find out what it grows into. But I'm hoping it's a hybrid. Fingers crossed. So, but with that, again, they're very much doable. They're probably one of the more forgiving. Again, probably I'm thinking of the most difficult. I think I don't know. They all have their challenges and they all have their ease. So again, if you're looking, the blueberries, the bog blueberries and low bush cranberries are probably some of the easiest to start with. The salmon berries are probably some of the most challenging. Which luckily you guys are in Cordova, so salmon berries are not the priority. But with that,
Well, it looks like Scott has a
Okay.
question.
absolutely. What's
Go
up,
ahead,
Scott? Hi, friend.
Hey, thanks for the presentation.
Thank you for
Mike.
all the students you brought.
Oh, no problem. So have you gotten a Nagoon to flower yet?
Not yet. I like right now, my most established Nagoon is the same clone that everybody has here in Anchorage, hence why nobody gets Nagoon fruits. It's a clone from the Alaska Botanical Garden. You have to have two or three different genetically unique individuals to cross pollinate. What I did notice is I started Nagoons very early this year. I started them in January, and I started them in plug trays. And by the time I was transplanting them in May, they had little rhizomes popping up. And by the time I planted them into 3.5-inch pots and put them out in the garden, the plants had already spread 3 to 4 inches in every direction. So I'm fingers crossed, but I think it's very reasonable to think that by starting them in January and February, we bumped up the timeline by a couple years. I'm expecting flowers probably within the next 1 to 3 years. But again, that's a hunch. Like I grew thimbleberries from Southeast, and they're going to flower on year 3. So it's one of those where we're kind of figuring this out. But I think Nagoons, by starting them early enough, we may be it may be a 2 to 4 year process. By starting them just outdoors, it may be a little longer. But we should have a definitive answer within the next 5 years.
Okay, I'll tell you if mine choose to flower in year 3.
Absolutely, please do, because again, you're ahead of me in that respect. So again, what you learn, we're kind of all figuring this out as we go. And when you have an answer there, that's an answer I can relay to other folks who ask the same question. I get the question all the time about when blueberries are going to bloom. I'm like, we're not there yet, guys. We're figuring it out though. So we know a bog blueberry grown in Wasilla, Alaska, specifically from seed outdoors its entire life, starts fruiting on year 7. So anything better than year 7 means we're winning.
All right, it looks like we got one more question from Catherine, and if anybody else needs to go, it is head on out if you want to head out. Go ahead, Catherine.
So I came late to the presentation. I don't see strawberries on artificial, natural, or preferred natural striations.
Absolutely.
Which,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna ask, you knew what the question was.
Yeah.
Where do they fall?
So what I'll say is my first year of growing strawberries from seed was last year, and I got them to grow, and they were starting to really develop their little true leaves, and then I let the flat get too dry and they died. So this year, Scott brought me actually some frozen coastal strawberries from Cordova, and I didn't quite know, like everybody said, okay, they need to be stratified. I'm like, well, frozen doesn't necessarily equate to stratification. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna blend these up and I'm just gonna mix them in with peat moss and leave them on the counter for a month. If they don't germinate in that month, I'll put them in the fridge. Well, they start germinating in that month. So the strawberries, you can absolutely go sow them and just mash berries into the dirt and let them grow. But I'm coming to learn that if you start them early, like mine started germinating in like October, and I transplanted them into plug trays. If you guys could see the pictures of the plants now, the plants have probably 20 leaves each. They're beautiful little strawberry plants. And I even have one that's starting to produce a runner, which is super exciting. So I think by starting them early, you're bumping up the timeline exponentially. They start off pretty slowly where they'll produce 1 little true leaf or 2 little true leaves. But if you start them early artificially, like I don't even think that they necessarily need cold. If you have frozen berries, I think that they've met their requirement, and you extract the seeds and plant them. They don't necessarily need stratification. They'll germinate, and by starting them early, you will have fully developed strawberry plants that are ready to send out runners by the spring. If you do them outdoors, they may be a couple years before they start sending out runners. So I think it's more of a matter of preference and how patient you are. I'm not very patient, so by starting them early and growing them through the winter, I will have fully developed beach strawberries to transplant out by spring and runners going out. I'm actually afraid about the runners because I'm like, they're still in kind of a nursery. They're in a plug tray on my nursery trays. I'm like, if they start sending out runners, they're definitely going to eat my blueberries next to them. But I think there's worse problems to figure out.
Okay. Thank you.
But absolutely. And if you figure something out, if there's a little nuance that you figure out, please let me know. I did notice with the strawberries where they'll start germinating in a month. and then you go basically, I take the mixture and spread it over a flat and they start germinating, you'll have seedlings keep popping up for a couple months. You'll have a flush of them initially and they'll start growing, and then you'll start seeing their brothers and sisters pop up over the months. And I still have seedlings. I sowed these back in October and I still have seedlings that are coming up today. So it's not like if you don't have germination immediately, it does not mean that they're not coming. Strawberries are just, they're kind of inconsistent. It may be one of those where you give them more cold and maybe they all germinate more consistently. I don't know yet.
Now, another thing with the strawberry, when I came here 13 years ago, there was a patch of strawberries, had a bunch of runners, but no berry. Now they've had some berries and stuff, but is there some seasons where they're like, nah, no berries, I'll just run?
So I think that could that absolutely be a factor? And this is what I'll say is this is not based on any reading. Scott may be actually able to answer this better than I can. But are there boom and bust years with our berries here in Alaska? Absolutely. But I think probably more of what you're seeing is probably a pollination thing. Strawberry plants on their own will produce some berries on their own with being self-fruitful, but typically if they have a genetically unique individual that's basically having runners spread with them and you have cross-pollination in the same patch, you're going to get better berry yield. But if you figure if they're all blooming and it's rainy that week in Cordova and the pollinators weren't very active, you just may not getting many berries. We have a beautiful patch of beach strawberries on a pull-off by Girdwood, and most years we don't get any berries on them, and it's mainly due to weather.
Okay.
But
Thank you.
absolutely. But what I'll say too, though, is cross-pollination could always be a thing. So if you grow a bunch of them from seeds, in theory, each seedling will be its own unique genetic individual. Thus, they will be able to cross-pollinate with one another. But if you clone the same one over and over, you're not adding any cross-pollination value. Another reason that we should be growing seedlings. Maybe a little bias, I guess.
And you can email this to us.
I can email it to you,
Thank you.
Catherine. I have a
Yes.
copy of it.
Awesome,
Absolutely.
thank you.
And what I'll say too is, on social media, with Bear Mountain Forest Nursery, if you have questions or if you guys want these instructions written down elsewhere, I have them literally saved in the notes on my phone. I will absolutely just send them out to you because I want you guys growing these. Because right now, like with the native plant nursery, I'm growing all these native plants, which is cool. There's a demand all around the state, but it would be logistically a lot more favorable for somebody to set up a native plant nursery in Cordova versus me supplying plants. Like I'm growing red huckleberries for folks in Juneau, and I'm like, these probably won't survive in my neck of the woods. I'd rather folks in Juneau like share the information I have so they could set up shop down there, then I could focus on my little bioregion. So any information I have, open game, please. This PowerPoint, if there's any benefit to it, please take it, use it however you wish. And if you want any more clarification, please send me messages. I will absolutely get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Guys.
That sounds cool.
Appreciate all your knowledge and your willingness to share.
Of course. Thank you guys so much. And hopefully you guys grow a bunch of awesome berries. And I can't wait to see the pictures of your beautiful berry plants.
Have a good night.
Bye, you guys.